The grand hall fell silent. Every noble daughter in the kingdom had been presented powdered, perfumed, and desperate. Duke Levan Zaldastani walked the line slowly and passed them all. Then he stopped, not at the Earl's daughter, not at the Countess's prize jewel. He stopped at Tamar, the girl no house wanted, the girl 3 men had already refused, the girl they called the kingdom's greatest embarrassment. Duke Levan turned to the king and said only 4 words.
I want that
one. The room erupted. But Tamar went pale, because she knew something no one else in that hall did. She knew exactly why he chose her, and it had nothing to do with love.
Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comment section and let me know where my kings and queens are coming from. Please, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, because it will help me to grow and encourage me to make more videos. As you're watching, don't forget to say what you love about the video and what you don't love about the video. It will help me to do better and satisfy you next time. Please subscribe. Let's continue.
The morning of the royal selection, Tamar Nakashidze didn't even bother pinning her hair. Why would she? She was only there because her father, Lord Georgi Nakashidze, a man drowning in gambling debts and desperate pride, had dragged her out of the kitchen garden where she'd been pulling weeds in mud-stained boots. "You will stand in that line," he had hissed, gripping her arm. "You will smile, and you will not embarrass this family. Not today." Tamar had almost laughed. Embarrass the family. As if she hadn't spent 19 years being the embarrassment herself, the daughter who read too much, spoke too plainly, and had already been rejected by Lord Arsen Tevzadze, who called her too sharp-tongued, by Baron Niko Kvaratskhelia, who said she was beneath his station, and most recently by young Sandro Abuladze, who simply said, "She frightens me." 3 rejections. In polite society, 1 rejection was a wound, 2 was a scandal. 3 made you invisible. So Tamar stood at the very end of the line, the last, the least, the one the court ladies didn't even bother whispering about anymore, and she watched the Duke arrive. And what an arrival it was! Duke Levan Zaldastani, the most powerful unmarried man in the entire kingdom of Iberia, commander of the Eastern armies, owner of 17 estates, the man even the king borrowed money from and never quite paid back. He was tall, taller than she'd imagined from the stories, dark-eyed, broad-shouldered, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved specifically to make women forget their own names. He wore no medals, no decorations, just a deep charcoal coat, simple and devastating. He did not smile as he walked the line. He simply looked. Each girl he passed straightened her spine, parted her lips, tilted her chin, every trick their mothers had rehearsed with them for months. He passed Lady Elaine Amirejibi, the most beautiful girl in 3 provinces. He passed Princess Nino Aristovelli, who had a dowry that could fund a small war. He passed them all, and then his footsteps slowed. Tamar felt it before she saw it, that shift in the air, the sudden, suffocating attention of an entire court swinging in her direction, like a compass finding north. She looked up. Duke Levan Zaldastani was standing directly in front of her. Up close, his eyes were darker than she'd expected, and they weren't moving over her the way men's eyes usually did dismissively, briefly, already bored. He was studying her, like she was a problem he had already solved, and was simply confirming his answer. "Your name," he said, not a question. "Tamar Nakashidze," she answered, and because she had nothing left to lose, she didn't look away. Something shifted in his expression. Almost nothing, but she caught it. He turned to face the king. The entire hall leaned forward. I have made my decision. The king straightened on his throne. And your choice, Duke Zaldastani? Duke Levan didn't gesture grandly, didn't perform. He simply said, Tamar Nakashidze, the Nakashidze girl. I want her. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the hall exploded. Tamar heard gasping. She heard her father make a sound she had never heard from him, something between a sob and a shout. She heard Lady Aline Amirajibi drop her fan. She heard a court lady hiss, the rejected one, like it was a personal offence against God himself. But she heard none of it clearly, because Duke Levan had turned back to her and he leaned in, just slightly, just enough that only she could hear what he said next. Don't look so frightened, Tamar Nakashidze. I chose you for a reason. What reason? She whispered. His jaw tightened. His dark eyes held something she couldn't name, not warmth, not coldness, but something sharp and purposeful that made her chest feel hollow. Because you're the only woman in this room who already knows how to survive a life she didn't choose. He straightened up, walked away, already done with the conversation. And Tamar stood there, surrounded by the chaos of a court turned upside down with the horrible, dawning realization that he wasn't wrong. And that made everything so much worse. What does the most powerful duke in the kingdom want with the girl nobody wanted? And why does Tamar feel like she just walked out of one cage? Straight into another? The servant walked 3 steps ahead and never once looked back. Tamar followed in silence, her mud-stained boots clicking against marble floors so polished she could see her own reflection staring up at her pale, wide-eyed and entirely out of place. The palace corridors stretched endlessly, in every direction, tall and cold, and lit by candelabras that burned without warmth, their light swallowed almost immediately by walls of dark stone and oil paintings of people who all seemed to be frowning at something just beyond the frame. She had lived her whole life in the Nakashidze estate, which was crumbling at the corners and smelled of old wood and her mother's dried herbs, where the floorboards groaned like old men in winter and the windows never quite shut all the way. It was small and tired and deeply imperfect, but it had never once made her feel like an insect walking through a cathedral. This palace did. Every corridor they passed through was wider than the last, the ceilings climbing higher until Tamar stopped being able to tell where the stone ended and shadow began. There were no soft rugs underfoot in these passages, no flowers left carelessly in a vase, no warmth of any kind, just marble and candlelight, and the distant sound of her own breathing. She told herself she was not afraid. She was not entirely convincing. The servant, a thin woman with silver hair, pinned so tightly to her skull it looked painful, finally paused before a set of double doors at the end of a corridor. So long Tamar had lost count of the archways they had passed. Beneath, the woman did not knock. She pressed her palm flat against the wood, pushed both doors open without ceremony, stepped aside, and looked at Tamar for the very first time. Her expression said everything she did not. Tamar squared her shoulders and walked in. The study was not what she expected. She had imagined something cold, something deliberately intimidating, a room designed to make visitors feel small. Instead, she walked into a space that felt almost suffocatingly inhabited. Books covered every wall from floor to ceiling, not arranged decoratively but used, their spines cracked and their pages marked with strips of torn paper. A fire burned in the hearth at the far end of the room, large enough to be generous but not theatrical. Maps were spread across every available flat surface on the desk, on the side table, on the floor in one corner, where someone had clearly run out of room and simply stopped caring. There were ink stains on the edge of the window ledge, a half-eaten meal on a tray that no one had collected. It was, against all logic, the room of a man who actually lived in it. Duke Levan Zaldastani stood at the window with his back to her, still in the same charcoal coat from the hall, his hands clasped behind him, as he looked out at a courtyard Tamar could not see from where she stood. He did not turn when she entered. He did not speak immediately. She refused to be the one who filled the silence first. It stretched between them for long enough that the fire crackled twice and a log shifted and fell inward before he finally turned. He looked at her the same way he had in the hall, directly, carefully, without performance. There was no cruelty in it, and no warmth either, just attention. The kind of attention that felt less like admiration and more like assessment. He moved to the desk and pulled a chair from beside it, placing it in front with the deliberate economy of a man who did not waste motion, and gestured to it without a word. Tamar sat. He remained standing, and she had a brief and furious internal debate about whether that was a power move or simply how he preferred to think. And then she decided it did not matter, because she was not going to let it work on her either way. He said, "I imagine you have questions." "Several," she said. "Ask them." She looked at him steadily. "You passed Lady Aline Amirajibi. She is considered the most beautiful woman in 3 provinces, and her family's alliance would double your northern landholdings. You passed Princess Nino Aristovelli, whose dowry alone could finance your eastern campaign for 2 years. She paused. You chose me. I am the daughter of a man who owes money to half the nobles in this kingdom. I have been publicly rejected 3 times, and I was standing at the end of the line because no one thought I was worth positioning closer to the front. She tilted her head very slightly. So I would like to know why. Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, more like the mild satisfaction of a man who had set a table and found his guest knew how to use the right fork. He pulled the chair from behind his desk and sat across from her, and the formality of the room shifted almost imperceptibly into something tighter, more direct. Because those women, he said, would spend the next 6 months trying to make me fall in love with them. Tamar said nothing. They were trained for it, he continued, without contempt, simply stating it the way one might state the weather. Every single one of them walked into that hall today with a plan, a strategy. They know which smiles to deploy and when. They know how to make a man feel chosen, while ensuring that they are the ones doing the choosing. He looked at her without apology. I do not have time for that. I do not have interest in it. And I will not be managed by a woman with prettier motives than she's willing to admit to. Tamar said carefully, And you think I'm different? I think, he said, that you stood at the end of that line today with your hair half pinned and mud on your left boot, and not a single rehearsed expression on your face. And when I stopped in front of you, you did not smile or soften or reach for anything at all. He held her gaze. You looked at me like you were already calculating the cost of whatever came next. The fire shifted again behind him. I need a wife, he said, and the word landed without romance of any kind, plain and functional, and entirely without apology. Not a performance of one. Not a woman who will spend her energy trying to reach my heart when I need someone using that same energy for something far more practical. Tamar felt something cold settle quietly in her chest. Not disappointment exactly, more like the confirmation of something she had already suspected from the moment he'd leaned in and spoken to her in the hall. This was not a rescue. This was not a fairy story where the powerful man sees the overlooked girl and recognizes something in her that no one else ever bothered to see. This was a transaction. She said, What do you need from me? He reached across the desk and turned a document toward her. She looked down at it without touching it. My grandmother, he said, controls the Eastern Estate. 40,000 acres, the most productive land in the kingdom. She has refused to transfer it to my name for 11 years on the grounds that an unmarried man cannot be trusted with the management of a legacy. His voice was entirely even. She is 73 years old. She has the legal standing of a sitting magistrate, and she is the single most immovable human being I have ever encountered in my life. She does not respond to negotiation. She does not respond to pressure. A pause, so brief she almost missed it. But she responds to family. Tamar looked up from the document. She wants to see me married, he said. Not engaged, not promised, married, settled, and in residence at the Eastern Estate within the month. She wants to meet my wife personally, and she wants to believe and hear. For the first time, something in his expression shifted into territory that was not quite comfortable for him, that it is real. The word real sat between them like a stone dropped into still water. Tamar said slowly, "You need someone to convince your grandmother that you married for genuine reasons." "Yes." "Someone who looks convincing." "Yes." "And you chose the girl with 3 public rejections and a ruined reputation," she said, "because no one," he said, cutting across her quietly but with absolute precision, "will believe I married you for your family's money or your political connections or your social standing. The only explanation anyone will be able to arrive at, after ruling out every other motive, is that I married you because I wanted to." He let that land. "Which is exactly what I need my grandmother to believe." Tamar stared at him. The fire burned. Somewhere deep in the palace, a clock was striking the hour, and she counted the chimes without meaning to 7, 8, 9. And with each one, the reality of where she was and what was being asked of her settled more completely over her. Like the kind of cold that doesn't bite but simply accumulates until you realize you've stopped feeling. Your hands. He was not wrong. That was the worst part. He had looked at her life, the rejections, the rumors, the quiet humiliation of standing last in every line she had ever been placed in, and he had found in it something useful. He had taken the thing that had made her worthless to everyone else and turned it, with the efficiency of a man who saw angles where others saw only surfaces, into the precise quality he required. She was valuable to him because she was valueless to everyone else. She looked down at the document again, then back up at him. "If I agree," she said, "what happens when your grandmother transfers the estate?" He did not hesitate. "You will be provided for, financially, permanently, and without conditions. You will have more independence than you have ever had in your life, and the Nakashidze name will carry the weight of this alliance for 3 generations. And if she doesn't believe us? Then we will have failed equally," he said, "and you will still leave better than you arrived." It was a remarkably honest answer. She had not expected that. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had upended an entire kingdom's mourning and dismantled every expectation she had ever quietly held about what her life was going to be, and she thought about her. The father's grip on her arm that morning, and the mud on her boot, and the 3 men who had looked at her and found her wanting. She thought about what it meant that the most powerful duke in Iberia had looked at her and found her useful. And she thought, very quietly, that useful was not the same as worthless. Even if it wasn't love either. She reached forward and picked up the document. "Tell me," she said, "about your grandmother." He studied her for a moment before he spoke, the way a man does when he is deciding how much truth to hand over and in what order. "Her name is Levan Zaldastani," he said. "She is the reason this family still has a name worth carrying. When my grandfather died, she was 31 years old with 4 children, a disputed title, and neighbors who believed a woman alone was an invitation. She rebuilt everything alone. By the time I was born, this estate had tripled in size, and every man who had tried to take advantage of her widowhood had either left the province or learned to be very quiet about it." Tamar said nothing and let him continue. "She is not cruel," he said, "but she is precise. She will see through performance immediately. She has seen through every performance I have ever attempted in my entire life, and I stopped trying around the age of 14. He paused. "She will ask you questions that feel like conversation but are not. She will watch how you move through a room when you think no one is paying attention. She will form her opinion of you within the first hour, and nothing that happens afterward will significantly alter it. So the first hour is everything, Tamar said. The first hour is everything, he confirmed. She looked down at the document, still in her hands. The language was formal and dense, but the bones of it were simple enough: a conditional arrangement, terms of residence, financial provision, discretion on both sides. Nothing about love. Nothing about expectation. Just structure, clear and cold and functional, as a contract for the supply of grain. She should have found that comforting. She did not entirely find that comforting. "When do we leave for the Eastern estate?" she asked. 4 days, he said. "That gives you time to collect what you need from your father's house. A car will be sent tomorrow morning." He said it the way he said everything, without asking whether 4 days worked for her, without framing it as a question at all. Not unkindly, simply as a man for whom the logistics of other people's lives had always arranged themselves around his decisions without resistance. Tamar set the document back on the desk, reached into her coat pocket, and produced the small pen she always kept there, out of the deeply ingrained habit of a woman who had learned early that no one ever handed you one when you needed it. She signed her name at the bottom of the page without ceremony, capped the pen, and stood up. He looked at her signature, then at her. "You didn't read all of it," he said. "I read enough of it," she said, "and I'm a good judge of what a man leaves out of a document versus what he leaves in. You left nothing dangerous out." She held his gaze. "If I'm wrong about that, I'll deal with it when it becomes relevant." Something moved in his expression again, that same almost reaction she had caught twice now, the one that wasn't quite amusement, but lived in the same neighborhood. He stood, and she realized again how tall he was, how the room seemed to organize itself slightly around wherever he positioned himself in it. The fire and the maps and the stacked books, all becoming backdrop the moment he moved. "The servant will take you to your rooms," he said. "You'll stay here tonight. It's late, and the roads to your father's estate are poor after dark." Tamar opened her mouth to tell him she was perfectly capable of navigating poor roads in the dark, and had been doing so her entire life, and then she closed it again, because the truth was that she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, and the rooms here would almost certainly be warmer than anything waiting for her at home, and there was no dignity in refusing comfort out of pride, when pride was the only currency she had left, and she needed to spend it carefully. "Fine," she said. He nodded once, and that was the end of it. The silver-haired servant reappeared in the doorway, as if she had been waiting, with her ear pressed to the wood, which Tamar strongly suspected she had been, and led her back out into the corridor. The room she was brought to was on the east wing of the palace, 3 floors up, at the end of a hallway that smelled faintly of cedar and old stone. It was large, larger than the entire upper floor of her father's house, with a bed that sat in the center of the room like a ship, draped in heavy fabric the color of deep water. A fire had already been lit. A basin of water stood on the dressing table, still steaming faintly at the edges. Tamar stood in the doorway for a moment, after the servant left, and looked at all of it. Then she walked in, sat on the edge of the enormous bed with her mud-stained boots still on, and put her face in her hands. Not to cry. She was not going to cry. Not tonight. Not in this room that smelled of cedar and belonged to a life she had not been born into and had not chosen. She simply needed a moment when no one was watching her hold herself together, where she could let the shape of the day press against her properly before she packed it down again and decided what to do with it. She had signed a document this evening that made her the future wife of the most powerful duke in the kingdom. 4 days from now, she would leave the only home she had ever known, crumbling and imperfect and deeply tired as it was, and move into a world that would look at her every single day and silently ask what she was doing. There. She already knew how to survive that question. She had been surviving it her whole life. That, she supposed, was exactly what he had counted on. She dropped her hands, looked up at the ceiling, and made a decision that felt small in the moment but would matter later. She was not going to spend the next however many weeks of this arrangement feeling like she was borrowed. She had agreed to this with her eyes open. She had signed her own name in her own handwriting. Whatever came next was hers to navigate, and she was going to navigate it standing upright. She pulled off her boots, set them beside the bed, and lay back against pillows that were softer than anything she had touched in years. She was asleep in under 3 minutes. In the morning she woke to thin grey light coming through windows that faced east, and for exactly 4 seconds she did not remember where she was. Then she did, and she lay still for one more breath, and then she got up. A dress had been left on the chair by the door, simple, well-made, clearly not intended to impress but to function, which she appreciated more than anything embroidered would have managed. She washed her face, changed, pinned her hair with the pins she always kept in her coat pocket, and went to find the dining room without waiting to be collected. She got lost twice. The palace corridors in daylight were marginally less disorienting than they had been by candlelight, but only marginally. She found a kitchen first, then a room that turned out to be a second library, then finally a long room with windows on both sides, and a table that could have seated 30 and currently seated 1. Duke Levan was already there, standing at the window again with a cup of something hot, reading a document with the focused attention of a man who had been awake for several hours already. He did not look up immediately when she entered, and she did not announce herself, and she crossed to the sideboard and poured herself tea with the straightforward confidence of someone who had decided 20 seconds ago to behave as though she belonged in every room she walked into. He looked up. "You found it yourself?" he said. "I found the kitchen first," she said, bringing her cup to the table and sitting down, not at the far end, not at his end, but in the middle, which felt like the honest choice. "And a second library. I didn't know you had a second library." "There's a third," he said, and returned to his document. She ate. He read. The silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was not aggressive either. It was simply 2 people in a room who had not yet developed the particular conversational habits that make silence feel like something other than silence. After a while he set his document down and looked at her in that direct way he had, and said, "Your father will need to be managed." She set her cup down. "I'm aware. He'll want to renegotiate the terms now that the agreement is signed. He'll want more than what was offered, and he'll frame it as a matter of family dignity." "He always does," she said evenly. "I want to be clear that the terms are fixed. What was offered is what will be provided, nothing additional." Tamar looked at him. "I'm not here to advocate for my father, Duke Zaldastani. I signed that document for myself." He looked at her for a moment. "Levan," he said. She blinked. "If we are to convince my grandmother of anything," he said, returning to his document, "you cannot keep calling me by my title in private. It will become habit, and habits surface at the wrong moment." He turned a page. "In private, use my name." Tamar picked up her cup again. "Levan," she said, trying the shape of it. And it felt strange in her mouth the way all new things do, slightly too large, slightly too real, like a word in a language she had just begun to learn and was not yet sure she would be fluent in. He did not look up, but across the table, in the grey morning light, with maps on every surface and a fire burning low in the grate, she watched the line of his shoulders settle by the smallest fraction of a degree, and she filed that away the way she filed everything quietly, carefully, without showing that she'd noticed at all. She was going to need to understand this man before they stood in front of his grandmother and asked her to believe in something that had started as a signature at the bottom of a page. She was going to need to know which parts of him were performance and which parts were simply how he was built, and she was going to need to do it in 4 days, across the distance he kept around himself like a second coat, without letting him see that she was looking. She was good at looking without being seen. 3 rejections had taught her that much. The car arrived at her father's estate the next morning before the dew had dried off the grass. Tamar had asked for it early, specifically because she knew what a later arrival would mean: her father awake, her father composed, her father with enough time to have arranged himself into the version of Lord Georgi Nakashidze that wore dignity like a borrowed coat and spoke in the measured tones of a man who believed he was owed more than life had delivered to him. She wanted to catch him before that performance assembled itself. She did not quite manage it. He was standing in the front doorway when the car pulled through the gate, already dressed, already upright, already wearing the expression she had grown up, interpreting the way other children learned to read weather, the tight jaw, the careful eyes, the particular set of his shoulders that meant he had spent the night deciding what he deserved from this situation, and had arrived at a very large number. She stepped out of the car, and he looked past her first, at the vehicle, at the crest on its door, and something moved across his face that she had never seen there directed at anything connected to her before. Respect, or the closest thing to it that Lord Georgi Nakashidze was capable of producing. It lasted approximately 4 seconds before he looked at her, and it became something else entirely. "You should have sent word," he said. "I'm sending myself," she said, and walked past him into the house. It smelled exactly as it always had: old wood and dried herbs, and the faint, persistent ghost of a damp winter that had never fully left the walls. She stood in the entrance hall and felt the particular weight of a place that knows you completely, every version of you, every small defeat, and she gave herself 3 seconds with it, and then she let it go. Her younger sister Ketty appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, hair loose, eyes wide. She was 17, and she had their mother's face, and she looked at Tamar the way she always did, with a mixture of admiration and anxiety that Tamar found both touching and exhausting. "Is it true?" Ketty said, coming down the stairs 2 at a time. "All of it? They're saying in the village that the Duke himself, that he walked past everyone, and—" "It's true," Tamar said. Ketty made a sound that was not quite a word, and grabbed both her hands and squeezed them hard, and Tamar squeezed back, and for a moment they just stood there, and it was the most honest interaction she had in 2 days. Then her father's footsteps crossed the threshold behind her, and the moment closed. "We need to discuss the arrangement," he said. Tamar released Ketty's hands and turned. "There is nothing to discuss. The terms are fixed." His jaw tightened. "I am your father. I have a right to." "You have what was offered," she said quietly, "which is considerably more than this family's current circumstances warrant, and which would not exist at all if anyone had bothered to position me better than last in that line." She held his gaze and kept her voice, even because she had learned a long time ago that volume was the weapon of someone losing an argument. "I am not here to negotiate. I am here to collect my things. I leave in 3 days." The silence in the entrance hall was the specific kind that happens when something true has been said in a place where truth is not usually welcomed. Her father looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "He'll tire of you," with the flat certainty of a man delivering a weather forecast. "Whatever he wants from you, when he's done with it, you'll have nothing." Tamar looked at him steadily. "Then that will be my problem to solve," she said, "as every other problem in my life has been." She went upstairs before he could answer. Her room was exactly as she had left it, small and spare, and organized with the particular precision of a person who has learned that order is the one thing you can control when everything else is being decided by someone else. She moved through it efficiently, pulling what she needed, leaving what she didn't. Books, 2 good dresses that still had their shape, her mother's ring, which lived in a box under the loose floorboard by the window, and which she had never told her father about, because he would have sold it years ago. Ketty appeared in the doorway and leaned against the frame and watched her pack with the expression of someone trying very hard not to say the thing they most wanted to say. Tamar said, without looking up, "Ask." Is he frightening? Ketty said. Tamar considered that honestly. He's precise, she said finally. He says exactly what he means, and nothing around it. I think people find that frightening because they're used to being given room to misunderstand. Do you like him? She folded a dress carefully. I don't know him. But you married him. I agreed to marry him. There's a ceremony still to come. She placed the dress in the bag. And liking someone is not always the first step. Sometimes it's something you arrive at later, if you're paying attention. Ketty was quiet for a moment. Then, very softly, Are you scared, Tamar? Tamar stopped moving. She stood with her hands flat on the open bag and looked at the wall in front of her, where a small crack had been working its way from the window frame toward the ceiling for as long as she could remember. And she thought about what honesty cost in this particular moment versus what it was worth. Yes, she said, but not of him. She closed the bag and turned around, and Ketty crossed the room and wrapped both arms around her and held on. And Tamar stood inside that and let herself be held for exactly as long as she could afford to, before the tightness in her throat became something she couldn't manage. She pulled back, straightened, and picked up her bag. She went back downstairs. Her father was in his study, with the door closed. She did not knock. She walked out of the front door and into the morning air, and got back into the car, and did not look back at the house as it moved away down the drive, because she knew that if she looked back, she would see Ketty standing in the doorway in her nightgown, and she would feel the full accumulated weight of every year she had spent in that house, and she needed to feel none of that right. Now, she kept her eyes forward and her hands still in her lap and breathed evenly until the estate disappeared behind the tree line. The next 3 days at the palace were not what she expected. She had braced for awkwardness, for the particular strain of two people who are strangers performing proximity, for long silences that curdled rather than settled. What she found instead was something she didn't have a clean word for, a kind of parallel existence. Two people moving through the same space according to their own gravity, occasionally intersecting without collision. Levan was gone most of each morning, in meetings she was not privy to and did not ask about. He appeared at midday sometimes, and sometimes didn't. In the evenings he was in the study, always with documents, always with the fire burning, and the maps spread, and the general atmosphere of a man whose mind had more rooms than his house did. She spent the days learning the palace, because she was not the kind of person who could exist in a space without understanding it. She found the third library he'd mentioned smaller than the other two, and tucked at the end of a corridor that required knowing to look for it. She found a garden on the south side that was clearly maintained but rarely visited, where the late-season roses had gone unpruned and were sprawling magnificently over everything. She found the room where the household accounts were kept, and resisted the very strong urge to look at them because they were not hers to look at. Yet, on the second evening, she was in the second library when she heard the door open and looked up, and Levan was standing in the entrance, looking mildly surprised. "I didn't know you were in here," he said. "I found it yesterday," she said. "I hope that's not—" "No," he said, crossing to the shelves on the far wall and pulling a volume without hesitating, the action of a man who knew exactly where everything lived. "Use whatever you like." He settled into the chair by the window without further conversation and opened his book, and she returned to hers, and they sat like that for nearly 2 hours, and it was the most uncomplicated she had felt since the day in the hall when everything changed. It was the quiet that undid her guard slightly. She hadn't expected quiet from him. She had expected strategy, management, the constant low hum of a man running calculations. And that was there. She could feel it underneath everything he did, but it shared space with something else, a person who was simply also just a person, who read in the evenings and left half-eaten meals on trays, and had apparently run out of room for maps on his desk, and solved this by putting them on the floor. She was still thinking about this on the third morning when he came to find her in the garden, and stood beside her looking at the overgrown roses and said, without preamble, "We need to talk about what my grandmother is going to ask you." Tamar straightened and gave him her full attention. "She will ask how we met," he said. "Not in the hall, before. She will not believe that I selected a wife from a formal line without having encountered her previously. It will need to have been something credible." Tamar thought for a moment. The Eristavali gathering, 8 months ago. It was large enough that neither of us would have been conspicuous, and small enough that a private conversation would be plausible. He looked at her. "You were at the Eristavali gathering." "I was in the kitchen helping with the food because Lady Eristavali owed my aunt a favour, and my aunt sent me in her place," she said evenly. "But I was there. And you?" "I was there for 40 minutes, he said. "I left early." "Then we met in the 40 minutes before you left," she said. "I was briefly in the east corridor when one of the serving dishes needed to be carried through. It's plausible. It's also unverifiable, because no one was paying attention to either of us." He was looking at her with that expression again. "What?" she said. "You're very good at this," he said. "I've been constructing plausible versions of events my entire life," she said. "When you're the person no one expects anything good from, you learn to build the scaffolding of a story very quickly, or the real one swallows you." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the roses. Then he said, "She's going to try to separate us. Neston, she'll engineer moments where she speaks to you alone, without me present. She'll be warmer in those moments, more open, and it will feel like an invitation to honesty." He paused. "It is not an invitation to honesty. It is the test." Tamar felt something sharpen in her chest. "What does she want to hear in those moments?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "She wants to hear something true," he said. "Something she couldn't have predicted. Something small and real that no one would bother to invent." His voice was measured, but underneath it she heard something she hadn't caught before, the very faint register of a man who had failed this test before, and knew precisely what failure felt like. There had been someone else. She understood that suddenly and completely without him saying it. Someone who had not passed the first hour. She did not ask. It wasn't hers to ask yet. But she tucked it away carefully, in the place where she kept the things that mattered, and she looked at the overgrown roses spilling over their borders in every direction, and thought about what it meant to be true enough to convince a woman who had spent 73 years learning exactly how people lie. "I'll find something true," she said quietly. He nodded once. But she noticed he did not say he was confident she would. And somehow that was more motivating than reassurance would have been. They left before sunrise on the 4th day. Tamar was already outside when the car came around, her single bag at her feet, her coat pulled close against the dark cold of early morning. The palace behind her was still largely unlit, most of its windows blind and dark, and she stood in the courtyard and watched her breath cloud in front of her and thought about nothing deliberate. Just let her mind sit empty for a moment, the way you do before something large begins. Levan came out 7 minutes later. He looked at her standing there in the dark without surprise, the way he was increasingly not surprised by the things she did, and he said nothing, just nodded once, and the bags were loaded, and they got in, and the car moved out through the palace gates into the grey pre-dawn roads of a kingdom that did not yet know what the day held. They drove in silence for the first hour. Not uncomfortable silence. Not the silence of two people avoiding each other. The silence of two people who had independently arrived at the understanding that conversation before daylight required a specific kind of energy that neither of them had available yet, and who were not going to perform otherwise. The sky lightened slowly, grey becoming pale gold at the edges, the road unspooling ahead through farmland and then forest and then farmland again. Tamar watched it all with her elbow on the window ledge and her chin in her hand, and found that the motion of the car and the changing landscape were doing something useful to the tight thing that had been living in her chest since she signed the document. It did not go away, but it loosened slightly, like a knot that has been pulled too tight and then given the smallest amount of slack. Somewhere in the second hour, without looking away from the window, she said, "Tell me something about her that isn't a warning." She felt rather than saw him turn to look at her. "About Nestan," she said. "You've told me what she sees through and what she tests for and what she won't believe. Tell me something that isn't tactical." A pause, long enough that she thought he might not answer. "She keeps bees," he said. Tamar turned from the window. On the east side of the estate, past the orchard. She has kept them since she was a young woman. She goes out to them in the early morning before anyone else is awake. He was looking ahead at the road, his profile even and unreadable in the morning light. "When I was a child and I stayed at the estate, she would take me with her sometimes, before sunrise, the same way we left this morning. She taught me how to move around them without frightening them." A brief pause. "She said that most things in life respond better to stillness than to force. That patience is not passive. That waiting with full attention is its own kind of action." Tamar looked at him. "She sounds like someone worth convincing," she said quietly. "She is," he said. And there was something in those two words that was not tactical at all. Something that had nothing to do with 40,000 acres or land transfers or the terms of any document. Just a man talking about a woman he loved in the uncomplicated way that sits underneath every complicated thing we do for the people who matter most to us. Tamar turned back to the window and stored that away with the care she gave to everything that mattered. The eastern estate appeared in the late morning, announced first by the change in the land itself, the fields better tended, the tree lines more deliberate, the road smoother beneath them, as though the ground understood it was approaching somewhere that expected better of it. Then the gates, old iron and enormously tall, standing open. Then the drive, lined with trees that had been growing there long enough to form a canopy so complete that the car moved through a tunnel of interlocking branches, the light coming through in shifting pieces. And then the house. It was not like the palace. It was older and lower, and built from a darker stone that had absorbed decades of weather into its surface, and wore it with the particular dignity of something that has endured rather than merely persisted. The windows were wide, and the gardens around it were not decorative but productive fruit trees, kitchen beds, roses that had been tended without being controlled. It looked like a place where someone actually lived in all the fullness that implied. Levan Zaldastani was standing on the front steps. Tamar had composed an image of her from everything Levan had said, and from the general idea of a 73-year-old woman who had rebuilt a family legacy through sheer precision of will, and she had imagined someone formidable in the way that large things are formidable. Tall, severe, architecturally intimidating. Nestan was small, not frail. There was nothing frail about the way she stood, or the directness of her gaze, as the car came to a stop, but genuinely small, fine-boned and upright, dressed simply in dark clothes, with her white hair pulled back. She had Levan's eyes, the same dark, undeflectable attention. She looked at the car, then at Levan as he stepped out, then, immediately, before anything else, at Tamar. Not rudely, not with hostility, with the focused and complete attention of a woman who had been waiting to form this opinion and intended to begin immediately. Levan said, "Grandmother," and crossed to her, and she took his face briefly in both her small hands, the way women do with people they have loved, since before those people could speak. And then she released him and looked past him at Tamar, who had come around the car and was standing on the gravel drive with her single bag and her unpinned hair and her mud-free boots, because she had thought to clean them this time. "Tamar Nakashidze," Nestan said, "not a question." "Yes," Tamar said. Nestan looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "You're smaller than I expected," and turned and went back inside. And Tamar understood from the angle of her departure that she was expected to follow. She followed. The interior of the house was warm in a way the palace had never managed, not just in temperature, but in feeling, in the accumulated evidence of a life lived fully in a space, books with cracked spines. A coat left over a chair, a pair of boots by the door that were clearly Nestan's and clearly had seen recent garden use. Flowers on the table that had been cut from outside, rather than arranged by anyone who arranged flowers professionally. Nestan led her not to a formal sitting room but to the kitchen, which was large and light-filled and smelled of something baking and something else that was sharp and slightly sweet. And after a moment, Tamar placed it honey. The particular warm, dark smell of it, close and present. Nestan sat at the kitchen table and gestured to the chair across from her and poured tea from a pot that was already waiting without asking whether Tamar wanted any. Tamar sat and accepted the cup and did not reach for the sugar, because she had learned a long time ago that accepting things exactly as they are offered is the fastest way to show someone you are not trying to manage them. Nestan watched her do this. Then she said, "He didn't tell you to dress differently." It wasn't a question either. "No," Tamar said. "Did you consider it? On your own?" Tamar looked at her steadily. "I considered whether what I wear would matter to you more than how I sit in a room. I decided it wouldn't." Nestan's expression did not change. But she picked up her own cup, and something in the gesture felt like a door opening by a fraction. "How did you meet him?" she said. "And I want the version that isn't the official one." Tamar's pulse moved, but her face did not. She said, "The Eristaveli gathering. 8 months ago, I was there doing a favour for my aunt, which meant I spent most of the evening in places guests weren't, which meant I was in the east corridor when he came through on his way out because he was leaving early." She paused. "He nearly walked into me because he was reading something while he walked. I moved. He didn't notice. I watched him go down the corridor, and I thought that man is very used to the world rearranging itself around him." Nestan's eyes were very steady on her. "That's not flattering," she said. "No," Tamar agreed, "but it's true, and I think he's aware of it, which makes it something different than arrogance." A silence. "Did you speak?" Nestan asked. "No," Tamar said, "not that evening." "Then what?" Tamar picked up her tea. "Then I went home and forgot about it, because a man like that passes through a moment and moves on, and the moment doesn't stay with him. I stayed with it slightly longer than I should have, and then I let it go." Why slightly longer? Tamar was quiet for exactly the right amount of time, not performing thought, actually thinking. Because it was the first time I had ever seen someone move through a room full of people who wanted his attention and not adjust himself for any of them, she said. Not perform indifference, just actually not require the approval. She looked at her cup. I found that difficult to put down quickly. The kitchen was very quiet. Nestan set her cup on the table with a small sound and looked at Tamar with something that had shifted almost imperceptibly from assessment into something adjacent to recognition. "He told you I would test you," Nestan said. "Yes. And you're telling me the truth anyway." "I'm telling you the truth because he told me you'd know the difference," Tamar said, "and because I'm not a good enough liar to construct something more convincing than what actually happened." Nestan looked at her for a long and careful moment. Then she said, "The bees need attending tomorrow morning, early, before the household is awake." She stood and picked up the tea things with the efficiency of a woman who had never expected anyone else to do it. "You should come." Tamar understood that this was not a casual invitation. She said, "I'll be awake." Nestan moved to the counter and then paused with her back to Tamar and said, without turning, "He has never brought anyone here before, not to stay. A beat. Not since the girl before." Nestan. The air in the kitchen shifted. Tamar held very still. "She was accomplished," Nestan said, her voice entirely neutral. "Beautiful, strategically perfect in every visible way. A pause. She looked at this house and saw an obstacle between herself and the palace. She looked at me and saw a problem to be managed. She looked at him and saw a position. She set the cups down. He saw all of it and said nothing for 11 months, and then ended it in a single conversation that I was not present for but heard about in sufficient detail. She turned around. Her eyes were direct and without performance. "He is not easy," she said. "He closes before you realize he was open. He will give you precision when you need warmth, and he will not always know the difference. He has spent so long being the most capable person in every room that he has almost entirely forgotten how to need anything." She looked at Tamar without softness, but without cruelty either. "I am telling you this not because I believe it will frighten you away. I am telling you because I want to see what you do with it." Tamar sat with all of that. Then she said, "What did the girl before do with it?" Nestan's expression moved for the first time into something that was almost, briefly, a smile. "She took notes," she said, and left the kitchen. Tamar sat alone in the warm, honey-smelling room with her cooling tea, and the sound of the house settling around her, and the full weight of what had just happened, pressing down with quiet insistence. She was not a note-taker, but she was beginning to understand that what she was walking into had layers she had not seen from the outside, and that the document she had signed at a desk in a firelit study was not the actual terms of this arrangement. The actual terms were written in something much harder to read, and she was only just beginning to find the first page. She did not sleep well. The room she had been given was on the second floor of the east wing, directly above the garden, and it was warm and quiet, and the bed was softer than anything she had slept in at the palace. And none of that helped, because her mind would not stop moving. It kept returning to the kitchen, to Nestan's voice saying, "He closes before you realize he was open," to the particular way she had said the girl before took notes, with that almost smile that held more information than most people's full sentences. Tamar lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and assembled what she knew. There had been a woman, accomplished, strategic, beautiful, 11 months, ended in a single conversation, and whatever had happened in that conversation had been enough to make Levan Zaldastani drive 4 hours to a formal selection line and choose the one woman in the room that no one would believe he had chosen for any calculated reason. She had assumed from the beginning that she was chosen because she was useful. She had accepted that. She had signed her name to it. But lying in the dark in his grandmother's house, with the smell of honey still faint in the air, she began to wonder if useful was the whole of it, or whether there was something else underneath that word that he had not shown her yet, possibly because he had not shown it to himself. She was still thinking about this when she finally fell asleep, and she was still thinking about it in the thin, cold dark of early morning, when she dressed quietly and went downstairs. Nestan was already in the kitchen, already coated, already holding 2 pairs of heavy gloves. She handed one pair to Tamar without greeting and moved to the back door, and Tamar followed her out into the cold dark of the garden. The orchard was further than it looked from the house. They walked through the kitchen garden and through a gate in the stone wall and along a path that ran between rows of apple trees whose bare branches reached across the path above them and almost touched. The ground was cold, and the grass was still carrying the night frost, and their breath moved ahead of them in small clouds. Nestan did not speak while they walked. Tamar did not fill it. The hives were at the eastern edge of the orchard, 6 of them, arranged with the slight irregularity of things that had been placed practically rather than decoratively. In the early half-light, they were very still. The cold kept the bees inside and slow, and Nestan moved among the hives with the unhurried familiarity of someone returning to a conversation they had set down the evening before. She checked each one in turn, lifting the outer cover with careful hands, tilting her head to listen, replacing it. Tamar stood slightly back and watched and did not ask questions, because the quality of Neston's attention made questions feel like an interruption. After the fourth hive, Neston said, without looking up, "He told you about coming here as a child." It wasn't a question. "Yes," Tamar said. "He told you what I said about stillness." "Yes." Neston replaced the cover on the fifth hive and straightened and looked at her. "Did he tell you why he stopped coming?" Tamar said carefully, "No." Neston was quiet for a moment, her gloved hands resting on the top of the hive. "He was 16, she said. "His father died that winter, quickly and without sufficient warning, the way some deaths insist on happening. She moved to the sixth hive. Levan was the eldest. There were decisions to be made immediately, things that could not wait for grief to finish, and he made them, all of them, correctly." She lifted the cover. "He came here that spring, and I took him out to the bees, and he stood exactly where you're standing, and he was absolutely fine." She paused. He was too fine. 16 years old and his father 4 months in the ground, and he stood here telling me about estate management decisions with the composure of a man twice his age. She replaced the cover and looked at Tamar directly. "I told him he was allowed to not be fine. He thanked me for saying so and continued being fine." A pause. "He did not come back for 3 years." Tamar stood in the cold orchard and felt the shape of that land inside her in a way she hadn't expected. "He locked it," she said quietly. "It wasn't meant to be said aloud, but it came out anyway. Everything he couldn't afford to feel at 16, Neston said. He put somewhere very deep and built something very capable on top of it. And the capable thing works exceptionally well." She pulled off her gloves. "But capable things are not the same as whole things." The sky was lightening properly now, the cold blue of early morning giving way at the edges to something warmer, and the orchard was beginning to take on detail and dimension around them, the bare branches and the frost-covered grass and the 6 hives standing in their slight irregularity at the edge of everything. Tamar said, "Why are you telling me this?" Neston looked at her with those dark eyes that were so precisely her grandson's. "Because you asked what to do with what I told you last night," she said, "about what he is, and I want to see if you understand what I'm giving you now." Tamar looked at her steadily. "You're telling me where the door is." Neston said nothing. "You're telling me there is a way in," Tamar said, "but that it requires me to be patient in the specific way you told him about, waiting with full attention, not forcing." She paused. "You're telling me this because you think I might actually do it." Neston put her gloves in her coat pocket. "I'm telling you this," she said, "because in 30 years no one has bothered to try." She turned and began walking back toward the house. "Come inside, it's cold." Tamar stood in the orchard for one more moment, alone with the hives and the lightning sky and the very large and unasked-for thing that had just been placed in her hands. And she thought about the document on the desk, and the terms, and the word useful, and how far she already was from the version of this arrangement she had agreed to 4 days ago. Then she followed Neston inside. Levan was in the dining room when they returned, standing at the window in the particular way he had that suggested he had been awake for some time and had already completed several things before the household had surfaced. He looked at them both when they came in, at his grandmother first and then at Tamar, and something moved in his expression that she couldn't fully read: relief, possibly, or its quieter cousin, the feeling of a thing going better than you allowed yourself to expect. Neston said she didn't frighten the bees, and sat down and poured tea as though this settled something. Levan looked at Tamar. Tamar sat down and picked up her cup and said nothing, and after a moment he sat too, and the 3 of them were at breakfast in the warm east-facing room with the morning light coming in wide and gold, and Tamar thought, this is what it is supposed to look like, not the palace, not the formal corridors. This. She understood immediately why the estate mattered to him beyond the 40,000 acres. It was the only place she had seen him near anything that resembled ease. The morning passed in the particular way of houses, with old routines, Nestan in her study, Levan receiving a man who arrived on horseback with documents that required an hour of closed-door discussion, Tamar left alone in the house with the freedom to exist in it however she chose. She chose the garden. She spent an hour pulling the worst of the dead growth from the rose beds, not because anyone asked her to, but because it needed doing, and her hands needed something specific to focus on. And she was still there, with dirt on her gloves and a pile of pulled canes growing beside her, when she heard footsteps on the path, and looked up, and Levan was standing at the garden gate watching her. She said, "I should have asked." "You don't need to ask," he said. He came through the gate and looked at the cleared bed and then at the pile. "You've been at this a while." "It needed doing," she said. He crouched down beside the bed and looked at it with the same focused attention he gave to maps and documents. And then he said, without looking at her, "She took you to the bees." "Yes." "What did she say?" Tamar sat back on her heels and looked at the side of his face. She thought about what Nestan had given her that morning, and how it had been given as something to use and not to relay, and she made a decision. "She told me you were gentle with them," she said, "as a child, that you had the right instinct for it." He was quiet for a moment. He looked up from the rose bed and at her, and the morning light was on his face, and his expression was open in a way she had not seen before, not unguarded exactly, more like he had simply not yet assembled the thing he usually kept between himself and whatever was happening. She felt the acute danger of this moment with complete clarity. She had been useful to him. That was the structure. That was the agreement. And something was happening now that was not in the structure and not in the agreement, and that she had not been careful enough to prevent, possibly because some part of her had stopped wanting to prevent it, somewhere between the kitchen and the orchard and the frost-covered morning and the 6 quiet hives. She looked away from him first, back to the roses, back to her hands in the dirt. "You should see the bed on the north side," she said, keeping her voice even. "It's in worse shape than this one. It's—" A pause. "Tamar," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that dark, careful attention. And for once it did not feel like assessment. It felt like something that hadn't decided what it was yet, something at the early, uncertain edge of becoming. He said, "She likes you." Tamar said, "I haven't given her reason not to." "She doesn't not like most people," he said. "She is simply indifferent to them. This is different." She looked at him steadily. "Is that important to you, that she likes me?" "It was the condition," he said. "I know what it was," she said. "I'm asking if it matters to you beyond the condition." The question landed between them and sat there, honest and slightly dangerous, the way questions do when they've stopped being tactical. He looked at her for a long moment. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere in the orchard, a bird started and stopped. "Yes," he said. Just that. No elaboration, no careful framing. Tamar looked at him and felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a clean name for, and that she was not ready to name even if she had. And she thought about Nestan saying, "He closes before you realize he was open." And she thought about 16 and composure, and 3 years without bees. And she thought about the particular courage required to say yes to a question like that, when yes cost something. She turned back to the roses. "The north bed," she said. "It really is worse." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, and she heard him move toward the gate, and she kept her eyes on the roses and her hands in the dirt, and held herself very still. He paused at the gate. "I'll have the tools brought out," he said. She did not answer. But when she heard the gate close, she let out a breath that she had been holding for longer than she realized, and she pressed her dirty gloved hands flat against the cold soil, and she stayed very still in the way that is not passive but is its own kind of action, and she let the morning hold everything she wasn't ready to carry yet. The tools arrived 20 minutes later, carried out by a young groundsman who set them beside the north bed without comment, and disappeared back toward the house. Tamar looked at them. Good tools, old and well-maintained, the handles worn smooth by years of use, and understood that he had not sent new ones from a storage room, but the ones that were actually used. The ones Neston used. That meant something, even if she wasn't ready to say what. She moved to the north bed and started. It was worse, as she had said. The dead growth was thicker here and more tangled, the kind of neglect that happens not from carelessness, but from a winter that came too fast and a spring that was too busy, and she worked through it methodically, finding the live wood underneath, cutting back to where the green was still present and the plant still had intention. She had been at it for perhaps 40 minutes when she heard the gate again. She did not look up immediately. She told herself it was the groundsman returning for something. She kept her hands moving and her eyes on the cane she was assessing, and then the footsteps came closer and stopped beside her, and she looked up, and Levan was there, in his coat with his sleeves already pushed up, and he crouched down across the bed from her and picked up the second pair of gloves without asking and put them on. She looked at him. He looked at the roses. "You said it was worse," he said, and began working. Tamar turned back to her side of the bed. They worked in silence for a while, and it was not the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of two people doing something real together, something that required attention and produced a visible result. And there was a particular honesty in that kind of shared work that conversation could not always reach. After a while he said, without looking up, "My father used to do this." She kept working. Let him continue. "He was better in the garden than anywhere else," Levan said. "In the house he was formal, correct. He knew how to be what was required. He cut a dead cane and set it aside. Out here, he just worked. He didn't perform anything." Tamar said quietly, "You missed that version of him." "I missed it before he died," he said. "I didn't see it often enough." He was quiet for a moment. "That's the thing no one tells you about grief. Sometimes you're not mourning who the person was. You're mourning who they almost were when no one was watching." Tamar sat back and looked at him properly, and he was still focused on the roses, his hands moving with the careful deliberation she recognized from everything he did. And she thought about Neston in the orchard, saying he was too fine, 16 years old and too fine. And she thought about all the years between that spring and this one, and everything that had been built on top of what had not been allowed to surface. She said, "Levan." He looked up. She said, "I'm not taking notes." He looked at her steadily, and she watched him understand what she meant, not just the words, but everything under them. The reference to Neston's kitchen, and the girl before, and the particular thing Tamar was telling him about who she was, and what she intended, and what she was not going to do with whatever he gave her. Something in his face moved, not the small, almost reactions she had catalogued over the past days. Something more significant, something that came from further down. He said, "I know." The garden was very still. "I knew in the study," he said, "when you signed the document without reading all of it, and told me you were a good judge of what a man leaves out. I knew you weren't the kind of person who collects information as currency." He looked down at the roses briefly and then back at her. "It was the second reason I chose you, after the obvious one." Tamar felt the ground shift slightly beneath the whole architecture of what she had understood this arrangement to be. "You didn't say there was a second reason," she said carefully. "No," he said. "I didn't." She held his gaze. "What was it?" He was quiet, long enough that a cloud moved across the sun and the garden went briefly grey and then light again. "You looked at me in that hall," he said, "and you were afraid and you didn't hide it, but you also didn't let it make decisions for you. You stood in the middle of your own fear, and you were still entirely yourself." He paused. "I have been in rooms with the most powerful people in this kingdom, and I have never seen anyone do that. Not genuinely. Not without performing the courage of it." He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes, and for once there was no distance in them, no management, Just a man saying a true thing to someone he trusted with it. I chose you because you were the only person in that room who was real. Tamar looked at him across the rose beds, with the dirt on her gloves and the pale morning sky above them, and the old estate house visible through the bare orchard trees, and she felt something complete itself inside her that she hadn't known was unfinished. She said, "That's a significant thing to not mention in a document." Something broke open in his expression, not the almost smile, an actual one, brief and unguarded and entirely unpracticed, and it changed his face so completely that for a moment he looked like a different person, or perhaps like the same person with nothing in the way. She felt it move through her like the first real warmth of a season changing. She looked down at the roses before it showed too clearly on her face, and she heard him make a sound that was low and quiet, and was also unmistakably a laugh. They stayed in the garden until the light began to shift toward afternoon, working through the north bed until it was cleared and the soil was turned and the living canes were visible and upright, and the whole bed looked like something that had been given back its future. It was not beautiful yet, but it had the structure of something that would be. Neston appeared at the garden gate as they were finishing and stood there for a moment, looking at the cleared bed and then at the two of them, and her expression was the most unguarded. Tamar had seen it not soft exactly, but open, the face of a woman who had waited a long time to see something and was now seeing it and was not going to make a production of the fact. She said, "Dinner is in an hour," and left. They ate in the kitchen that evening, not the formal dining room, but the warm one with the fire and the honey smell and the table that had clearly hosted 30 years of family meals and showed all of it in its surface. Nestan served without ceremony. Levan poured the wine. Tamar sat between them and felt, for the first time since the hall, not like a woman navigating a situation, but simply like a person at a table. Nestan talked about the bees. Levan talked about the eastern road that needed regrading before winter. Tamar talked about the rose bed and what it would need in spring, and Nestan listened to this with the focused interest of someone who cared about the answer. And at some point during the meal, Tamar looked up and found Levan watching her with that expression that she now recognized, the one that lived just past assessment and had no defensive quality to it at all, and she held it for a moment before she looked back at Neston and continued talking about the roses. But she felt it. The whole rest of the meal she felt it, warm and steady as the fire in the grate. After dinner, Neston stood and said she was going to bed with the directness of a woman who did not make excuses for needing rest. And then she paused at the kitchen door and looked at them both and said, "The papers can be drawn up on Thursday," and left. The kitchen went quiet. Tamar looked at the fire. The papers, the estate transfer, the thing the entire arrangement had been built around, the reason she was here, the condition that had to be met before Neston would move anything into his name. It had apparently been met. Neston had decided, in her kitchen, in her orchard, over a north garden bed and a dinner that required no performance from anyone, that she believed what she was seeing. She said, "She's satisfied." "Yes," Levan said. A pause. "Then the arrangement is complete," Tamar said carefully, keeping her voice even. "The condition is met. The terms can proceed." She heard him set his glass down. "Tamar," he said. She looked at him. He was watching her with that full, unguarded attention, and his jaw was set in the way it was when he was about to say something he had not rehearsed and did not have the architecture prepared for. "The arrangement," he said, "is not what I'm thinking about." The fire shifted in the grate. Outside the kitchen window the night was very dark and very still. She said, "What are you thinking about?" He said, "The north bed, what it will look like in spring." She looked at him and understood that he was not talking about the roses, or rather that he was talking about the roses and also about something that grew in similar conditions in cleared ground, with the dead weight removed, with enough patience to wait for what was living underneath to find its way to the surface. She said quietly, "That's a long time from now." "I'm aware," he said. "I'm not in a hurry." Tamar looked at this man, who had spent 11 years building capable things on top of unfinished grief, who moved through rooms of powerful people without adjusting himself for any of them, who kept bees in the memory of early mornings with his grandmother, and had maps on the floor because he had simply run out of table and hadn't bothered to care, who had looked at her at the end of a line where no one else had looked and seen something real, and she thought about what Neston had said about waiting with full attention, about patience that is not passive, about how most things respond better to stillness than to force. She said, "You'll need to learn to leave the study before midnight." His expression moved. "That's negotiable." "It isn't," she said. "I'll want the fire. There are 2 fireplaces in the study." "I'll want the chair," she said. "The good one by the window." "That's my chair." "It was your chair," she said. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment, and the kitchen was warm, and the fire was low, and outside the window, the night held everything steady and still. And then he said, very quietly, with the full weight of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean, "Yes, I suppose it was." Tamar felt something settle in her completely, not dramatically, not with the force of something arriving, but with the quiet certainty of something that had been making its way toward her for several days across frost-covered ground and orchard paths and cleared rose beds, and had finally simply arrived and put its things down. She picked up her cup. He picked up his glass. The fire burned between them. Outside in the dark orchard, the 6 hives stood in their slight irregularity, and the bees slept in the cold, and the north garden bed sat cleared and open, its living canes upright and waiting for a season that was not yet here, but was, without question, coming. And in the kitchen of the eastern estate, in the warm and the honey smell and the unhurried quiet of a night that belonged entirely to them, 2 people sat with the full attention of those who have decided, without announcement and without performance, that whatever grows next, they will grow it together. Now, before you go, drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. If this story moves something in you, hit that subscribe button. You clearly feel stories deeply, and there are many more waiting for you right here.